And we're live. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Kara.
Hi, Kara. Hi, Michael.
Hello, Roger.
So today, with my panel of guests, Rogério Marques, goes by Roger now, and Michael Lopiano, we are going to talk about the metacrisis. There was an interesting video, I linked it in the description below, where in September, John Verweyke, Daniel, I don't want to butcher his name, and Ian McGillichrist discussed the meta-crisis and general philosophy. And this discussion kind of inspired today's live stream. I also wanted Rogério and Michael to get acquainted because both of them kind of put their free time towards the same thing, which is bettering, inspiring thought, inspiring conversation. Rogério does philosophy live streams, also, philosophy discussions on Twitter, which I have been privileged to participate in. And Michael starting his couple new projects and absolutely amazing videos on Instagram and sometimes on Twitter. The descriptions are below. You can please follow them. So first, to warm up, I would like each of my guests introduce themselves and say a little bit more about their projects. So, Rogério, would you like to go first?
Okay, thanks, Kara, for arranging this stream, and it's a great. It's quite exciting to be with like-minded people like Michael and yourself to discuss such a challenging subject. And so, as for myself, I will try to be concise. My background is in biochemistry. So since very young, I became interested in the life sciences and natural science in general, and I became quite suspicious about organized religion due to my parents' will. I went through the process of being introduced until my early youth into the Roman Christian religion with all the sacraments that involved, but I became so skeptical about the value that it had as an organization, and also the stories that it had, that I abandoned it for many years and kind of described myself as an atheist. I went through university education pursuing my life sciences, biochemistry, without paying much, assigning much value to religion. And then after a decade more or less of working as a science communicator, I realized that although my intellect has become sharpened due to my education and also my professional experience, my character, I realized it needed some work because of, especially because of what happened during the lockdowns during the pandemic. I realized and seen this with other colleagues of mine that were in more challenging confinement styles of living due to this hardship imposed on anyone or everyone. So I started to take some workshops and courses on emotional intelligence, on management, on leadership, dipped my toes in this other subject than just intellect. And then I realized that the greatest leader that I could turn to get lessons on leadership and character building was Marcus Aurelius, who fortunately left his thoughts in writing. And so I started there my own journey in philosophy. Marcus Aurelius mentioned so many great thinkers from before him, not just the ones in the school that people assigned to him, the Stoics, but many others like the Pythagoreans, even Hippocrates, the Platonists, etc., even Socrates. And so I took his references to other thinkers before him as recommendations of further reading. And so I just rabbit holed into Greco-Roman Hellenistic philosophy, then went to other regions of the world like Persia, China, and India, and I got a sense of comparative mythology and also comparative philosophy, which really truly opened my eyes. And I'm just scratching the surface, and by comparing different cultures with my own, and probably my own culture, contemporary culture, it has many common features with your own, Kara and Michael, and many other people listening. By looking at the comparisons with ancient cultures and cultures from different parts of the world, it gives a big perspective, a clarified perspective, increasingly clarified perspective on what our culture is missing, where we are going wrong, and how to fix this. And it, I think, gives me some preparation to discuss and deal with something as big as Metacrisis, I think. And so I would leave it at that and give chance for Michael as well.
Great. Yes, thanks, Roger. That's an excellent an excellent overview of quite a lot of time in your life. So that's helpful, right? I think specifically in this particular video that is underlying today's topic is this idea that it's not enough just to sort of have someone's argument or have someone's opinion, but to understand that opinion embodied in that person's life. And that's certainly something that the ancients understood when they wrote these philosophical biographies, right? I think about Diogenes Laertius's collection of the Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, right? It's this idea that you don't really know the philosophy unless you know the philosopher, because the real philosophy is the philosophy that's embodied, not just the one that is a series of arguments or propositions that then you abstract and then logically debate and then just sort of arbitrarily decide whether it's true or not, right? It's always embodied in a real person's life. So that was a very excellent spirit that you took to describing your own life. So in my particular case, as an introduction, so I have for some time now been particularly interested in the Renaissance. So for those who will see my media, my name on a number of different things, it's titled in a lot of places 21st Century Renaissance. And I am interested in the Renaissance not only as an historical phenomenon. I did my PhD actually in history and Renaissance studies. So my background is in humanities. It is also in philology, so classical Romance and as well as Slavic philology. And I was interested really since about the end of high school in what the Renaissance was, what it meant. It felt like there was something distinctly different about this time period to me, about something that was going on. And I came to this actually maybe in I want to say my junior year, so my second to last year of high school. In high school, I studied Italian as my foreign language requirement. And I was very early introduced to the works of Dante. Of course, you might say, okay, well, Dante is not a Renaissance thinker. He's a medieval thinker, whatnot. You can give arbitrary distinctions periodically to these people. But there's something clearly different going on with Dante. And there's sort of this idea that Dante is this liminal figure, that there's something going on with him that is still the spirit of Renaissance, even if he has a medieval structural or political worldview, something like that, right? But so I got exposed to the Renaissance quite well at this time period of my life, about 16, 17 years old. and got acquainted with Dante specifically in the way that I participated in poetry contests, poetry recitation contests, where I recited sections of the Divine Comedy. And this was very interesting to me. I don't think I really understood quite what was going on, but there was something about this that felt different. So I decided to pursue a deeper study of this. I studied with an undergraduate. I learned about the Divine Comedy from a teacher named Walter Stevens, and sort of pursued a deeper understanding of 14th century Italian poetry in particular. That was my preoccupation as an undergraduate, and primarily in the area of vernacular poetry, right? So I was very interested in Dante, and I was very interested in Petrarch as well, the sort of the coincidence of these two figures, what they were attempting to do with their poetic works. And then towards the end of undergraduate, I became acquainted with a instructor there by the name of Christopher Celenza, who for my first 3 years of undergraduate had studied, actually he was directing the American Academy in Rome before he had come back. And I took his courses on the Renaissance. I was like, oh yes, finally, someone who's going to teach courses like on the Renaissance kind of holistically. There was no one that was doing that. So I said, okay, let me go take this guy's courses. And it was striking to me because it was like, okay, well, actually most of the Renaissance is not about vernacular poetry. Sure, it's there. You know, you've got the romances, you've got things like Orlando Innamorato, you've got Gerusalemme Liberata by Tasso and Boiardo and things like this. But really, that's a small part of it. The majority of the Renaissance is about Latin works and the recovery of Greek and the translation of Greek into Latin and the revival of classicizing Latin and familiarity with classical authors. And I was like, oh, interesting. That's, turned out that's not what I studied at all, but that's what I want to learn about. I mean, I was very happy to study the vernacular aspects of the Renaissance. They're also important, but so I decided to do a graduate program, and my graduate program was in Renaissance studies. And I was like, I want to do this. I effectively want to now get a classical education as much as I can, and I want to try to understand what the Renaissance was about, because it seems as though my entire understanding of it as this sort of flowering of vernacular poetry or something like that is really just only a very small part of it. And so I started studying Renaissance humanists, which I also came to learn was not a contemporary term, but a 19th century term. So then there was this whole history of, thinking about the Renaissance is in this particular way is a 19th century phenomenon that comes from Germany, something like that, right? Without getting into too much detail, I spent a number of years going through coursework in my graduate program, and it was very helpful, and I learned quite a lot. But at the end of that time, I still did not understand what the Renaissance was, right? I spent, 2 years in coursework. I spent, a lot of time reading a number of books about early modern Europe and doing all kinds of different graduate fields and oral examinations and things like this, and wrote a prospectus and was like, okay, I'm gonna go study a humanist in Poland who was Italian, who's doing humanism, and I'm gonna figure it out. I'm gonna figure out what's humanism. I'm gonna figure out what the Renaissance is, because I'm at the end of this. I just studied this for 3.5 years very intensively. I still don't know what it is. I still don't know what this thing is. I know what people have said, but I don't really understand it. I don't have a model of this. And what my graduate advisors told me to do before going off to do my research in Poland was specifically, they said, okay, well, you know what? Interesting questions, but just do this. Just try to figure out what this guy thought, right? You have this particular, there is this particular poet and historian, his Latin name, Callimachus Experiens, his Italian name is Filippo Buonaccorsi. Just figure out what he thought. Just do that, right? Write about that. So I said, okay, I'll try to do this. And I took this very seriously and was just like, well, how do people think? What does it mean to think? How do you know if someone is genuine, right? Because we were living in this graduate school intellectual time period of like, well, everybody's disingenuous because everybody wants power. it's a kind of Machiavellian, appropriately, a Machiavellian view of the world, that really everything is just an instrument toward the acquisition of power, and you shouldn't take anything anyone says at face value for that reason. Okay, there is some use in that, right? In that there are other things that people are saying besides what they say, right? Don't take someone maybe just at face value, because we don't necessarily know everything that we're saying. When we say something, there's something else that's happening there at the same time. So there is a value in that approach, but this idea of, well, really it's just all about power, and people say things. And the Renaissance, for example, the Renaissance was this elite movement that was about power and majesty and establishing a new aristocracy or splendor or propaganda on the part of the popes or something like that, right? And it's not to say that that's not a part of it. It's not to say that there weren't people who were doing that. But was that really what everybody was doing? Was it really that the only reason that this massive cultural movement that somehow we attribute the entire, the birth moment of modern civilization was really all about a cynical power grab? That I just couldn't, I had a very difficult time with that. And so this led me down an investigation of thinking about, like, well, really, how do people think? How do people only think? Where does emotion come in? How are our brains constructed? How do we think there's all this narrative thinking in biographies and history writing and epic poetry, and why did they care about this? What's going on? What was going on? Why all of a sudden did everybody care about this? And I started investigating. I started reading quite heavily Jordan Peterson's work as a psychologist. I started reading McGilchrist's work in particular. I discovered McGilchrist and his hemisphere hypothesis through Peterson. I sort of had this idea because I was listening to Peterson's lectures and I was reading his books and also reading his reading list, which was a lot of Carl Jung and Bohlingen authors. And also Viktor Frankl as well. I was living in Krakow, so I was also simultaneously thinking very deeply about Auschwitz since I lived right next to it. And I was like, okay, what really is going on here? And I discovered McGilchrist's work because McGilchrist also had this sort of idea that there was some sort of underlying rebalancing or sort of meta awareness of modalities of seeing the world, paying attention to the world, that's expressed in his hemisphere hypothesis. And he makes this point that the Renaissance, he gives some evidence for it. It's not an exhaustive treatment of the subject, but at the end of The Master and His Emissary in 2009, he does talk about this a bit. It's not really, most of it is the hemisphere stuff, but then he kind of has this tail argument about how you can see the sort of right hemispheric mode of attending comes through in the Renaissance, or comes through in Greek thought at times like Heraclitus, and comes through in the thought of some of the Romantics, because he's very interested in Schelling's Naturphilosophie. And I was very interested in that, and that's really kind of become my obsession for the past 3 to 4 years, has been trying to see, like, oh, okay, there's a claim here that there is some sort of disequilibration of modes of human perspective in looking at the world, that we sort of modify our environment in such a way, it's our tendency to modify our environment in such a way that the environment that we build for ourselves has that disequilibration settle in. And that there are these moments that realign things, and that maybe the Renaissance was that. Maybe the Renaissance was a moment of restoring a kind of equilibrium that had been lost. And if we decide to talk about that particular element, I can go into deeper detail on that. But I'll say that since finishing my PhD last year, I did some teaching at the university level. I taught at several universities in the state of Connecticut. And I had a really difficult time sort of saying like, hey, I have these ideas. I would like to research this. I would like to teach this. But I had a really difficult time finding someone in a university context who wanted to say like, yes, we think these ideas are developed enough that we would like to offer you the potential to become, a full-time professor here or something like that. And to a certain extent, I don't blame them, right? I had these ideas toward the end of my PhD. There's probably a lot of systematizing type of work, articulation that I would have to do maybe to have that be something that someone would go like, okay, let's explore this together. So I decided to withdraw from my university teaching. I was also kind of unhappy with the structure, yes, the bureaucracy, yes. McGilchrist complains about this in this interview a bit that we're talking about today. And I also found that especially at kind of mid-tier universities, there is a kind of disingenuous, maybe knowing exploitation with respect to finances that is happening in the United States as far as kind of gently or ideologically kind of coercing students who do not necessarily belong in college. It doesn't, they don't need to go to a university. It's not, they would be better served by kind of going and doing a technical career or something like that. Those pathways are more open and more popularized and more accessible in Europe as compared to the United States, where in the United States it's just everybody's got to go to a 4-year liberal arts card. Everybody's got to do it. In such a way, I think that mortgages their future kind of unfairly. So I'm teaching online now and attempting to use my free time to explore these ideas with people such as you and Kara. So I'm really happy to be here today and hear what you guys think on this.
Thanks, Michael, for shedding some light on where you come from and what you have been focusing your attention on during these previous years. Since you are passionate about the Renaissance, I want to make it clear that I'm also so passionate about the Renaissance that I actually am doing what I can to inspire a second Renaissance, basically. I would also like to, if I may, to kind of pick your brain a bit, because there's some gaps in knowledge on my part, which is I suspect that the Renaissance came in the heels of the bubonic plague and the reeling of European society, the kind of breakdown and collapse of the feudalistic society that was very, very crystallized and it didn't move much. It didn't allow for great innovation. Power and money was concentrated in the church and also the nobles. The nobles didn't care about intellectual pursuits much, and the church, they weren't very fond of outreach. They were very esoterical. They kept their Plato's Timaeus to them, and they only had to appoint Plato's Timaeus anyway, which is crazy. It's crazy when I realized this was the case. Until late medieval age, before the Renaissance, the only Plato medieval Europe had was Plato's Timaeus. But what was associated with the Renaissance was also the rediscovery and retranslation to Latin, translation to Latin in the first place, the rest of the known Platonic dialogues, and with those many other works of Greek thought, of the best, highest philosophy from ancient Greece, from the Hellenistic tradition, even as far back as the Ionian tradition, which to my mind, since they were very wealthy as well due to commerce and had some drivers to innovate technologically, they seem to me foreshadowing of an earlier kind of Renaissance that unfortunately didn't bloom due to the Persian conquest. And so, this is kind of like a jumble of thoughts, but feel free to say if this matches what you know, because I'm wondering if hardship and catastrophe and calamity was also one of the ingredients of this renaissance that ended medievalism in a way.
Yes, so there are a number of points there that I yes, will definitely. Okay, so let's see where to start. I will start with your point on catastrophe. So I think this particular question here that you have is precisely the question that leads me into seeing the kind of similarity between, let's say, what was the late medieval metacrisis and our current metacrisis, because they share similarities, but there is a question of scale that is different. So my position that I haven't necessarily argued this anywhere in particular in writing or research, but it's been a particular element of my thought that's been kicking around for quite a while. And it is that the late medieval world was also facing a metacrisis, not actually that different from our own. Different in quantity, yes, different in some of its content or material, but formally very similar. That's at least the hypothesis. So yes, there was a major inciting crisis that did occur in the middle of the 14th century, which was the second global outbreak of, or at least Eurasian and North African outbreak of Yersinia pestis, the Black Death. The first, of course, being the Justinian plague from 539 to it was the first outbreak is around 539 to 542, and it's endemic until about the 8th century. It's not until maybe the early 8th century that the plague has finally died down. And of course, it has a similar effect as the Black Death in the 14th century. Both of them see, over the full endemic period of the plague, at least in the context of Europe and the Mediterranean, a reduction of the population from the total population from anywhere to 60 to 65%. So major reduction. What is notable about the Black Death is that it is perhaps the last or a midpoint, or it is one of a host of crises that occur at this time period in the 14th century. And I was thinking about this as I was taking a look at this interview with Schmackenberger, Vervaeke, and McGilchrist, because they do hint to some of these elements, or hint to something in the context of our metacrisis. And really, prior to the Black Death, and this is important to note, the period of about what is sometimes called the 12th century, kind of larger, or the long 12th century by medieval historians, which includes, starting in maybe about the 11th century, but sometimes even going up to about the 14th century. You can include the 13th century in it. Europe had achieved a level of prosperity that had actually surpassed even the Roman Empire in terms of quality of life, lifespan, the ability to support a population. The population of medieval Europe in the 13th century, so just by about 1300, some estimates pointed to being over 100 million people, right? The entire population of the Roman Empire at its height under Trajan, between the reigns of Augustus and Trajan, was only about 75 million people. And that is the entirety of the Mediterranean, reaching very deep into the Middle East and encompassing all of Anatolia. The population of Europe, right, just Latin medieval Europe, maybe also including the Balkans as well, 100, at least 90 to 95 million, perhaps as high as 110 million. So really quite an achievement. And this expansion in population had brought untold, really unprecedented agricultural wealth, agricultural wealth in Europe that had not been seen for many centuries. Keep in mind that in the Roman period, what was able to sustain the Roman population was that the Romans harnessed and essentially harvested the agricultural wealth of the Middle East, places like Egypt, Carthage in North Africa, that this was responsible for really buoying up their empire. It was not because they had developed this wonderful agricultural infrastructure and they had exploited the land in, say, northern Spain and Gaul and Britain to such a great extent that these regions were sustaining the empire, right? It was really the East that was the heart of the empire, and why this was, okay, things are happening in the West, but we got to make sure we deal with the Persian threat, because the East is, if there's no East, there's no empire, sort of something like this. So medieval Europe had really, high medieval Europe, 12th century Europe, had done something that the Romans had not. And they had done this without having the kind of agricultural support of the East, largely because the East and the West, the Islamic world and the Latin Christian world, were inimical, to a certain extent, to each other. They did collaborate. There was exchange. It was not that Muslims and Christians were always at each other's throats, especially at borderlands. There was a lot of cross-cultural collaboration. It wasn't, all kind of the sort of caricature of the crusade and jihad, and they're just killing each other all the time. No, far from that. But not the type of agricultural integration or logistical support that, say, the Roman Empire was able to support. So that's an important consideration. Another point on this is, you made this comment about feudalism and the distribution of wealth and such. And for Italians, this was a concern. Germans, to a certain extent as well, there had been a concentration of wealth, right, primarily agricultural wealth, in the hands of a feudal noble elite. This is especially true because especially in this time period, there's not actually that much, right? We think of Italy as being this, what a rich agricultural country. There's not actually that much land in Italy that is really good agricultural land. You've got this bit in Campania, you've got some areas in Tuscany, the south can be a bit better, but even Sicily and Calabria tend to be somewhat arid, especially at the medieval climate optimum, where the average temperature in Europe was close to what it was now. This was not really the best land, partially because of how Sicily was somewhat dry. It was still useful, but not on the scale of maybe say France, where France had quite a lot of agricultural land and did not perhaps have the same kind of centralization of good land in the hands of a few very powerful families. So there's historian Robert Sabadino Lopez, who famously wrote a number of histories on the medieval growth of commerce between 950 and about 1300, and really said, well, the Renaissance was actually a period of economic decline, not a period of economic flourishing, despite the fact that there is this massive flourishing of the arts and a comparative and relative growth of cities versus populating the countryside. That the real commercial revolution, the real great economic expansion of Europe, was something that took place in this high medieval period and was similar perhaps in its expansion. It was a period of massive urbanization. Never before had such a proportion of, perhaps to a certain extent in the Roman period, but never before had Europe, including Central and Western Europe, been so urbanized. Never before were so many people engaged in a commercial economy, right? This is a Europe that does not have a very robust slave system. It is not a slave economy. The Roman economy, which is easy to forget sometimes, was a massive slave economy. The Roman economy was built on top of, perhaps even as much as in the late Roman Empire, half of its population being slaves, right? Not being free individuals. Even though medieval Europeans did keep some slaves, It was largely very, very wealthy city or noble families, and typically close to cities that actually had access to areas where slaves could be imported, say from the east, right, from the steppes, typically. So one of the elements here that I want to point to that also connects to this idea of that Daniel Schmachtenberger had is this idea of taxing the land, right? Taxing the environment. We're in this position where we have this ability to tax the land and stress the environment in an unprecedented way. And yes, again, I'll say that right now, right, we have an issue of scale that does not align with the medieval period. However, there was a similar unprecedented level of taxing the environment that was achieved in the high medieval period that had drastic consequences in the 14th century. This is sometimes called the Great Famine. It took place in 1317. And what had happened was the European population had expanded so much that there was wide-scale deforestation. The term that appears in the literature is French historians notice this, is called a défrichement. It is that much of Europe's forests had been cleared in order to make new agricultural land, because there wasn't this ability to concentrate, right? It wasn't a sort of, okay, let's do agriculture in depth, right? Today we have insane agriculture in depth, where we can have only 2% of our population engaged in agriculture and produce actually even still way more food than we need. So this was not the case. You still had to have about 90% of the population engaged in subsistence agriculture. And that 90 to 90 something percent was able to produce a tiny surplus that then could support this, 8 to 10% of the population that did not have to do that. And that's in a place like Italy, right? In Eastern Europe, say Poland or Russia, right? The Russian lands, the Rus. It was much higher because the land gave less fertile yield. So something like 97% of the population was engaged in subsistence agriculture. So what happened in 1317 was there was a shift in the climate, right? In the course of the 13th century, the medieval climate optimum had started to peter off, right? There are these natural cycles in the Earth's warming and cooling, and a cooling cycle had been well underway. What this meant was Europe cooled, it became a bit more arid, and the temperature fell, causing lower crop yields. However, the areas that this affected were primarily those lands that had been cleared in the process of défrichement. These are marginal lands. They did not have high yields. They did not yield surplus. And so they went from being just adequate to being inadequate to support their populations. There was a large-scale migration, and maybe about 8 to 10% of the European population starved to death in this very, very bad harvest year in 1317, and which continued, right? This continued to be a problem, lower crop yields going into the Black Death. So something like exactly the setup that had happened in the 6th century with all of these volcanic eruptions, right? 536 being the worst year to be alive because of 2 years of essentially nuclear winter from multiple volcanic eruptions, right? So there's this coincidence of massive, rapid climate shift to the cooler side, jeopardizing agriculture, a rapid decrease in nutritional quality, and then, as you pointed out, the Black Death arriving and crippling the European population and going through these cycles of population decrease for 100 years, right? Europe's population doesn't even reach its nadir until something like 1450 or 1460. It is over 100 years, 150 years of population decline, which is very difficult for us to imagine. So I think you're very right to point out these particular environmental crises and the degree to which they had this effect on stimulating perhaps a Renaissance phenomenon. I have a few thoughts. I want to pause for a second because I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'd like to give, rather than just go on forever, right? I have a few more thoughts about what this would mean, what this also meant in the same time period, culturally and politically. But I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks for attempting to piece together my incomplete picture of what gave rise to the Renaissance, because
Wonderful.
I had this idea of the Black Plague being prior to the Renaissance, but it seems from your basically what you told me right now is the second best after actually time travel, because you gave a vivid picture of things that have been going on in this time period, and also comparative with the Romans as well, and late antiquity. So it seems like what happened with the famine, and then maybe the famine weakens the population's health, immunity, and whatnot, and then the Black Plague just had the population weakened enough for it to actually become a plague. And the reduction of population in such a catastrophic scale, the actual writings that depict people's personal experiences, losing relatives, choosing whether to be with the relative until their last hours and die with them as well because they will be infected, or just coldly going away. This was a concern. This was extremely a great humanitarian problem that was happening. It was terrifying, and it was horror basically, because people were seeing their reality escaping from under their feet, literally. All this hardship, according to pretty much all the wisdom traditions that I've been exposed to, from the Hellenistic ones to the Chinese ones, Indian ones, Persian ones, all of them show that we can reinterpret hardship as being a signal or a fuel to propel us to become better human beings. Like Marcus Aurelius said, the obstacle is the way. Also, your picture pretty much seems to validate this idea of the four horsemen. You have famine, and then you have pestilence, and then you have the social breakdown and probably power grabs that will also create conflict, armed conflict, war, and all the death associated with famine, plague, war. So history repeats itself in these patterns, showing basically the four horsemen arriving together, with different emphasis in different periods. But anyway, it seems that people's drive to seek and retrieve ancient wisdom associated with all this context, all this historical context, to recuperate the wisdom from ancient Greece, the Hellenistic and Greco-Hellenistic traditions at large, Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism, Platonism, etc. These writings were translated to Latin finally. They probably supercharged how people would deal with the world, how they would interpret the world. Also, Christianity was profoundly influenced since the beginning, basically, by Greek thought. I've seen scholars commenting on the lessons by Stoics like Musonius Rufus and Epictetus, saying, "Wow, this is so similar to what we have in the Gospels." It's crazy. And the Stoic lessons were 1st and 2nd century, while the Gospels supposedly a few centuries later, like 3rd, 4th century, perhaps. And so we probably can take a few lessons from what happened that gave rise to the Renaissance and the Renaissance itself for what we are going through. I find this historical, philosophical, religious comparison very, very important. As I mentioned in my introduction, I have been an atheist for after leaving the church, but I don't consider myself an atheist anymore because of all the practices I've been engaging with from all these traditions I know about. The wisest people that humanity has known have talked about things beyond the material world. And although I don't have any confirmatory experience or rather objective validation, I at least give it the benefit of the doubt that there is something beyond just the stuff, tables and chairs that we can see. And so maybe if we can engage ourselves with these wisdom traditions and the practices that are worthwhile that they have, that supercharge our character development, which honestly in our contemporary world we literally have almost no practices of self cultivation. Our contemporary culture, compared not just with the ancient cultures at large, including slaves and serfs, no, looking at the best of the best individuals of those times, that's what I'm talking about. We can see people like Socrates and Plato trying really hard to educate the citizens around them. They were seeing that the Athenians were pretty foolish. They did things like the Sicilian expedition, which was catastrophic. They just threw away the flower of the youth of Athens, just like that, trying to overreach their overextend their reach. And since we have so much power to transform nature nowadays, we could even, at the press of a few buttons, finish everything, literally. At least the people in power, really. We don't have the luxury to be foolish anymore. We need to institutionalize and deeply ingrain in our contemporary culture forms of wisdom that will make us reevaluate our place on Earth. And instead of looking at Earth as a bunch of natural resources, we should be trying to think where we can fit into the cycles of Earth in a way that Earth gives us and we give back to it, in a way that we even leave Earth better for us existing than the opposite, which is what is happening with the fisheries that we have, with the huge nets that go through the surface, and not to mention how we have been kind of taking all the carbon from under the ground and basically putting it in the atmosphere. Of course, as you mentioned, there is the Earth periodically changes its average temperature, whether we do stuff or not. It's one of the phenomena, the cycles, is called the precession of the equinoxes. It explains this idea exploited by George R.R. Martin of the long winters in his fantasy world. But this was, of course, as many tropes in his stories, taken out from history. Basically, winter is coming and then we have harsher winters than usual. It can happen, as can happen the opposite, temperatures going up for a cycle, and if we add to that, it will be even harder on us. So we should actually be interested, like a surfer looks at the waves as something he cannot change. He cannot direct the waves or control their rate. He can only try to go with the flow of the waves and have a ride and respect what nature is doing. So this is where I'm trying to piece together bits and pieces from the past, trying not to overwhelm myself with knowledge, because, as Heraclitus said, an abundance of knowledge does not necessarily make people wise. And this is what we do have. We can basically we have a biblical flood of knowledge and entertainment and stuff thanks to our digital technology and internet. We can spend our entire life just taking in information without it necessarily making us wise. We need to have a kind of, not a caste system applied to people, but a caste system applied to information and knowledge. We need to figure out what are really essential pieces of wisdom that humanity must necessarily adopt, regardless of the religious or cultural background. We need them. We need to put them in place, and people need to know about them so that they can at least consider them as a life choice. Because we don't even have that. Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Car.
I would like to dial back, Michael. Just give me a second. I'd like to dial back and maybe come back to comparing the two periods. Let's say I kind of see the difference in our. We are divided from each other. We are connected through information right now, but we are also, because of being connected all over the world, we are seeing the differences between people. And the people who connect, they are not necessarily in the same regions. So as it was in the past, let's say, as an example, I can take building by Teutonic Knights, huge castle, the biggest, really enormous castle in Poland, in Malbork. So they built it in the 13th century, and in many stages. And it was kind of inspired as well. What allowed it was the fact that believe in God, Christianity, it kind of enabled it. But right now, the thing that enabled those huge constructions in the past, we don't have that privilege anymore. And so, like, the point I'm trying to make is that we are isolated in a way. Like, there is no monarch that can gather people and tell us what to do. Like, to be honest, like the right brain, let's say, the right part, the master is missing in a way, or he's weakened by the left, by the emissary. For guys who read the book.
Let me just attempt to address that. We tried to build the master. Europe tried very hard. He entered into competition with other great masters of Europe, like Thor. People in the north of Europe had all these trinkets of the Mjolnir, and then this other masters, idols, were in competition in late antiquity, early medievalism in Northern Europe, to see whether Thor was the big role model of Europe or this other figure. In the south of Europe, at least to my knowledge, it was between him and Pythagoras. We had Iamblichus trying to depict an awesome Pythagoras, and probably like a supernatural Pythagoras, and probably we have all these fantastical stories about Pythagoras being like
Rogério,
awesome.
I get it,
but it's
regional. What I'm trying to, like,
exactly.
My point is the fact that we're decentralized. So how can we build, let's say, a cathedral if people, let's say, it's analogy, it's not the actual, let's say, 100,000 of people believe in Thor, but they are spread across the world. And to build a cathedral, you need an entire society to do it, and being on board with it, and being in one region simultaneously. And that's what I see that we are lacking at the moment.
I have something I think that will connect both of. So connect both of a couple points that Roger, you touched on at the last time you spoke, and Kara, your question here regarding sort of connectivity, right? How can we come together rather than this phenomenon of isolation? How do we resolve that, right? Because clearly the Middle Ages, the ancient world, they had this problem much less. I mean, this problem did emerge at a few points, but they had this problem less. And I think my response to that question of yours, Kara, I think connects well to 2 points in particular that, well, certainly at least one, but I think 2 points that you brought up, Roger. One of them is character education, and the other is sort of a graduation of knowledge, something like that, or access to knowledge. So I guess I'll start with the second point first, and how this can relate to Kara's question about interrelationship. Right, it's perhaps one thing that we forget nowadays, living in this environment that you spoke of, Roger, where we're absolutely suffused with knowledge. We are absolutely suffused not only with knowledge, but access to it, and it gets put in front of us, and we have to do something with it, right? Like, this is I realized this too. There was sort of a major supposition, let's say, of the Enlightenment, that we are all rational. Every single human being is a rational individual, that if you give a human being a certain level of education, you will basically instill a perma-rationality in them. You will make them into a permanent rational actor. Oh, and then you'll make states into perfectly rational actors. And one of the findings, right, of the 19th and 20th century that sort of pushed back against that, but still has not been generally accepted, I can at least say in the United States, I don't, maybe in English-speaking countries, I don't know, maybe the West as a whole, is that human beings it varies per human being, the degree to which someone can be rational, and that is highly dependent on how conscious one may become of oneself in one's capacity to necessarily not be rational about some things. That there are many dimensions to the human person which are not rational. For example, love is not rational. You do not love someone, you do not fall in love because you rationally constructed the motivation to fall in love. In fact, one might say that, a lot of times, right, I think this is something that, Vervaeke, when he was speaking about love in this particular conversation, particularly mentioned, like, love is not even an emotion, because love is something that causes all of these different emotions. You can be with someone you love and be overjoyed. You can be with someone you love and be extremely frustrated. You can be with someone you love and be, at a loss for words, right? There are actually all of these different emotions that come with it. And as he also mentions, right, what is it that a parent expresses for their child more than love? Because it's a lot of different emotions, and really none of them seem on the surface like they're in the parent's interest. But there is something about that is absolutely essential to human life, and without it, really, our species would die. We would all be gone, right? We would completely fade away without love. So there's something, it's not rational. I mean, you can kind of get that sort of afterwards and be like, oh yeah, well, I guess our species will die, and that's a rational choice. But then you don't then have like, well, rationally it's good for me to fall in love, so then you can just pick any old person and fall in love with them. You can't do that either, right? So there's some sort of presupposition, right? And we have different capacities for that kind of self-conscious, patient type of rational thinking that we can take to decision making. Our ancestors perhaps understood this well, in that there is most of the decisions that we make via inherited wisdom, tradition, habit, something like that. and that they are predicated. This is something, for example, Jordan Peterson says, and I think McGilchrist says it as well, although Vervaeke doesn't like the language of value. And it's this idea that there are certain value-based axiomatic presuppositions about our lives in the world that we inherit, that are some of them are self-evident, but they are self-evident in the same context as another host of self-evident potential values. And the question is ordering them. And we receive an instruction, we inherit a kind of instruction that allows us to align those values in a particular sequence or combination, depending on the person, depending on the context. And once they're in place, it is an article of faith or an axiom of faith that you follow them under the promise that that the life that you live will be good. You don't necessarily, rationally evaluate every single time you make a decision whether all of your values and axiomatic presuppositions ought indeed to be in place, something like that. And so the suggestion that I took from this particular interview on the Metacrisis was that certain common values, perhaps what Vervaeke would prefer to call points of love, something like that, a proper ordination of them so that they form this pyramid of hierarchized value, right? A hierarchy of value. Vervaeke talks about a hierarchy of value. McGilchrist talks about a hierarchy of value. Peterson talks about a hierarchy of value. All these guys are just like, there needs to be a hierarchy of value. They're all in common on this. There's got to be a hierarchy of value. And there's an interesting phenomenon that I can at least say anecdotally, experientially, occurs when I pursue that kind of intrinsic value, or certainly McGilchrist calls it intrinsic value. Something's intrinsic value versus its extrinsic value. What the value that the thing or the cause or the person or whatever it is, the action has unto itself, that is embodied within the thing itself, that cannot be measured by some kind of other type of measurement. You cannot do sort of an exchange between its intrinsic value and something else and say, yes, the love for my wife is equivalent to the value of 3 sons, right? That doesn't, right? You can't quantify it like that. You can't do it. That's an absurd question. I think McGilchrist brings up that point too. That's an absurd question. How big is the beauty of your wife? Like, what? You can't ask that. That's silly. But therein lies a certain sense of value and a certain constellation and hierarchy of those kind of values. A sense of the sacred, truth, beauty, and goodness, right? That are above utility, and that the right ordination of these values brings others who share them into community naturally, provided there is there is a road out there somewhere that they can take, that human beings have some sort of ability, right? Because we manifest these values, or because we have these values kind of settled and made conscious to a certain extent, the behaviors that naturally human beings exert in the pursuit of these values make themselves manifest to us in the way that our attention brings the world into being by ordinating ourselves with respect to them. So right, to wrap that, to repackage that in a way that maybe makes a bit more sense, right? And to really make the connection between what I just said and Kara's question here, is that what enabled perhaps the building of things like Gothic cathedrals, projects that took centuries, that took a sort of not only inheritance of technique, but an inheritance of design, right? It took a perspective, it took many perspectives to be inherited, right? So that the cathedral would end up as a a harmonious whole, yes, but it has like an internal logic to it. There is a logos to the whole of the cathedral. It does not look like, you know, various guys smacked pieces together and said, behold, a cathedral. Nor is it just a very basic geometric shape like a box. You know, okay, well, a cube is going to look like a cube because it's got to have these, you know, Euclidean geometry says it's got to have these proportions, right? No. There is an inheritance of vision, perspective, a way of bringing the world into being that enables these sorts of people to come together and work toward a common purpose that is far greater than them. And that then, because in their lives they are thinking about it based on their values as something greater than them, when their bodily life ends, it can continue because it was always designed to be something that would transcend their bodily life. That is built into the very preconditions of even seeing the cathedral, is that they are anchored towards something that transcends their bodily life. So to this end, yeah, what's that, Karen?
I say it's meaning, right? Like the building the cathedral would give their short life meaning. So I am a part of this something eternal that I'm building, and that was in itself like something that gave meaning to a life of the builder, like who built like part of the northern wall, let's say.
Sure. I think
I get it. We don't have that anymore.
Yeah. Well, this I think is right. This plugs into Peterson's project, where Peterson, right, he's expressed this as such, and I think this also comes up in this same interview. I forget who particularly said it. Perhaps it's Vervaeke, but an idea that, well, meaning is found. Yes, it's in that sort of transcendent project, like the building of the cathedral, but it's not the project itself. It is the relation of it is found in the relationship between the project and something higher that transcends, right? It is the relationship, the place of that project within the context of a story, of an overarching story, and that story contains, I don't know, something like, I don't want to use the word heuristic, but I can't find another word at the moment, but like the heuristic for finding the right kind of transcendent infinite meaning that such a project could be plugged into and act as a conduit into the life of the individual for the experience of meaning. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I was thinking about suspended rationality a little bit and love. They both sound to me like surrender in a way.
Say this again?
Surrender to something greater than you
surrender.
are. Surrender. Yes. Yeah, I would like maybe to give some room to Rogério.
Yeah, I'm quite keen at tackling this challenge by Kara of the people being involved with something greater than themselves and probably conferring meaning to their lives that maybe makes them contact with the sublime. So to give you an example of something, of a piece of culture that is still alive today that we can use to compare with the building of massive medieval cathedrals, is a Japanese temple that is rebuilt in wood every 2 decades. So the Japanese city of Ise, which is located in the Mie province, it houses a Jingu temple, whose reconstruction has occurred periodically since 690 Common Era. During an empress's reign, it was the inception of this tradition, and the ceremony commonly known as Sengu consists of jingle reconstruction every 20 years. And so they not only put into place the actual plan of the temple made in wood, with the carpentry techniques known to the Japanese, exclusively with wood, no nails. They also implemented all the cultural infrastructure that is all metaphysical, of teaching the next generation of carpenters to employ precisely the needed techniques to rebuild the temple flawlessly, since the 7th century until today, even going through periods of extreme adversities like the Second World War. And this has been done without failure. And so this, to me, it's a point of comparison with the medieval construction of massive cathedrals, and it can help us inform what kind of solutions we need to procure today to build things like O'Neill cylinders, habitats in space, and other things that can help us become more resilient, anti-fragile, a base in the moon that is self-sustainable and uses cycles of nature and whatnot, or on Mars. So these things are extremely lofty propositions that could either be like a Sicilian expedition where we just throw people to their deaths, or they could be actually things that we figured out how to surmount, and we can actually do something that will be comparative or maybe even overshadow accomplishments of the past. All these things, thanks to our incredibly profound advances in material technology, are almost reachable. But we need to figure ourselves out as characters. So figure out what love and caring for each other and for these bigger projects than ourselves, like planting date trees. Only after a century, after we are long gone, will it start giving dates. So another thing that I wanted to do is quote Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who said, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum them up to gather wood, divide the work and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea." And so the point here that we need to tackle firstly is not the techne, it's not the how management and whatnot, the pragmatic things. We need to first figure out how to solve ourselves as characters. We need to stop having these unknown shadows within us that are pulling us apart from each other, are making us care less about each other and about these really very meaningful potential projects, these calls for these heroes' calls that are just mere whispers to ourselves that we could attend to and actually make something really meaningful that will even have meaning 10,000 years in the future, and not necessarily as an kind of an ego venture. Oh, I want to be remembered. No, it's just I want to make something that will even help people thousands of years from now. That's what I want to do, and I don't care if they remember my name or my bio, whatever, whatnot. And so this is a part of it. I will also want to tackle the subject of love very briefly.
Right. I was going to say, could I would love to build off of, since you've twice now very excellently expressed this idea that harmonizes also with your personal mission, and I have to agree with you on this. I think both from my own kind of experiential point of view and from my examination of the Renaissance, this idea of character education, as you've called it, as Kara's referred to it, as self-betterment in a certain way, as some of the thinkers that we've thought about and mentioned here have called it, right, about value, or perhaps yearning for the sea. I thought that's a great quote to have brought up. And I think this as well, this example with the Japanese temple, this method of teaching, right, not just, okay, here's the skill, right, here's the book, read about how to swim, there you go, but this sort of system of passing down not only what you need to do to build the temple, but how you need to live in order to be in a state of being able to do this, not only for you, but kind of infinitely, right? For as long as possible, that this type of activity can continue. And I'd like to make a comment on this with respect to, again, what we've been thinking about with respect to the Renaissance. And I'll try to say it briefly so that we can get to this next point you have about love as well. But you're very keen to see this in light of the character education and education of values and of wants, of motivations, of yearning, something like that. And this is, again, also something that in this particular interview was sort of gestured at a bit. But the idea that, really the people, the first people that we can point to as having driven the Renaissance as a cultural and intellectual movement were what the people who the 19th century has referred to as Renaissance humanists. Again, this is a 19th century term based on how they understood their educational system. There was this debate in 19th century Germany about whether schools should be humanistic, meaning like just sort of focused on life and character in the world and how to live and the arts and things like that, or that whether they should be prosanthroponistic, meaning something like utilitarian, a more sort of utilitarian idea.
Technical, maybe.
And what's that?
Technical, maybe. Perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it, right? They should teach more practical skills. What's all this about learning Latin and Greek? In Germany, we should be teaching them, French and English and Russian, because these are the countries we need to care about. There are borders, there are geopolitical rivals. This is really what we should be thinking about. Not so much, okay, some Latin, maybe some Greek, sure. But do we really need to be teaching them about Athens and about the late Roman Empire? We should be teaching them about German culture and German history and the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire in our cultural heritage. Okay, they made some good points, but this sort of, I don't want to spend too much time in the 19th century, but really this term, they said, okay, well, this sort of inheritance that 19th century Germany had from the Renaissance, which was character education, an emphasis on using the Latin term mores, right? So customs, habits, behaviors, but mores being the root of our moral philosophy, what you should aim at. Cicero refers to it as fines, right? De finibus, ends, which is a direct translation of the Greek, which is totelos, right? Tatelotes, ends or goals. Which, believe it or not, is actually, I learned this very recently, is cognate with our word for culture. So what to value and what to focus on, right? But there was this idea, right? The first people that we can point to and look back, they're these people who referred to themselves as poets. That's what, for basically the 14th and 15th century, they didn't call themselves humanists. They called themselves poets. But what did they practice? What did they teach? They said they taught arts known as the studia humanitatis. Humanitas, which is the origin of our word for the humanities, something like that. But the idea of the studia humanitatis and of these poets who were teaching mores was that if they wanted to make the world better, if they wanted to solve these crises, what they had to do was focus on values, virtue, character, right? What are the things you need to value so that you develop the right habits, so that you become the virtuous kind of person who can make society more prosperous? And this was, again, without going into too much detail, this was a response, and this is, I think, something that Vervaeke mentions, is something of a response to the philosophical movement of the 14th century in the church, the late 13th, early 14th century, which had become very legalistic and which had developed nominalism, right? So nominalism, this sort of idea of there are no things out there, there's nothing out there, right? It's really, there are no universals. There are only particulars. And the only thing that particulars have in common is names. That's it. Words are the only thing that unites things. So whatever name you give to something, unites it, right? It's up to you as the namer to unite things, something like that. There are no common universals. There are no connections between things beyond that. It's only something that occurs in your mind and is not something that happens in nature, with the mind, of course, being kind of separate from nature in this sort of a kind of Cartesian precedence sort of thing. I don't want to sell nominalism short. There's some other elements to it, but I don't want to go into too much detail either. And I don't know it that well. I'm not an expert in 14th century medieval philosophy. But this was also a problem, right? And the humanists particularly complained about this. They were not welcome at the universities. Their type of teaching, their enthusiasm for the classics, their enthusiasm for what prior generations of classical thinkers, even pre-Christian thinkers, had to say about character was very different from the 14th and 15th century orientation of the universities and the scholastic philosophers toward the classics, which were, we can use these to learn Latin, we can use these to learn facts and history and something like that. Maybe some techniques, disputational techniques. Aristotle's wonderful, they love Aristotle. But really,
the organons.
Of course. But, really beyond that, poetry, we don't want to be reading that because there's all this suggestive stuff and there's all these sexual themes and, there's Ovid's got the Ars Amatoria and there's all this, right? And Apuleius has this horribly lewd novel and he's getting inducted into these Isis rites and there's, premarital sex and all this happening in here. So we don't want to, no. That we don't even want to look at what's in these unless we really have to, something like that. And the humanists took another approach, which is, part of the entire reason why we have these people that you're referring to from the classical world, Rogério, right? Some of these texts survived in single manuscripts that were hidden in a monastic library that were made, in the 9th century during the reign of Charlemagne, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
So, I think historically, this capital R Renaissance that happened first as this concern with character education, and everything else kind of stemmed from there. And so I think you're absolutely on the money that if something similar is like that is going to happen, and I happen to agree with you, I think the conditions that we're facing now are very similar, and that the answer to that, probably another discussion to ask the question of, did that work? I think the answer is yes. What Europe was able to achieve was in part a consequence of this tradition that lasted so long and is only maybe kind of dying out, maybe in the last 50 years or something like that. But I think you're absolutely right. And I think you're absolutely right to point to that as something that we should be paying attention to if we're interested in perhaps igniting a similar type of solution to a similar type of problem.
So if I can, thanks, Michael. I really hope that we might be onto something and we might have something to make a difference and contribute. I honestly do, because I think it's sorely needed, and more people need to also figure out things even independently of us, so that there is no one single kind of profit going on with things like these that humanity kind of needs, because we are just dealing with our common heritage here. We have two treasures that we often forget, and we think, wow, I'm a self-made person. We have a 4.5 billion year old genetic treasure that allows us to even live and have joy and all the other things besides joy as well, life experience and consciousness, being as consciousness of the universe. While we also have, fortunately, what survives of it, what is extant of it, our cultural treasure as well. and it's heartbreaking to have realized what was lost. Like, just to give a very, very brief example, Democritus, Sophocles, and Epicurus, three titans of the ancient Greek world that wrote hundreds of volumes. From them, we only have like a few letters and 7 plays. The rest has been lost forever, thanks to war and putrefaction of manuscripts, whatever. So we have lost so much. It's not like history is always a forward progress thing. We lose so much, and this is just touching on Western things that have been lost. We have lost so much from Chinese and Buddhist traditions and whatnot, thanks to the happenings of history. But to go to love, I honestly think love is a very important part of character education, and we need to be very, very precise of what we mean by love, because in our contemporary culture, using love as a word is a word that does a lot of heavy work, because people could employ this word to say I love fish, and they are actually saying that they like that someone uses extremely inhumane methods of fishing with bycatch and destruction of corals and environment and whatnot to bring them a fish to their plate, or aquaculture that is, it's disgusting, and they want to have a fish that they can eat, that has been gutted and killed and fried and whatnot. So people use love as a word for this, and people use love as a word for relationships that are one-sided, that one of the individuals overpowers the other and kind of has this Machiavellian interest that the other is kind of weakened and subdued. And it degrades the other person, the beloved, and the lover, so to speak, and beloved is kind of utilitarianly benefiting from the other in a way that doesn't pay back to the other person. So when I use the word love, I'm specifically drawing from the tradition that comes from Diotima and Aspasia, filtered through people like Plato and Socrates and Xenophon. And we are so fortunate to even have the thoughts of these two wise women through these men that haven't been lost. And I think in the case of Platonic dialogues, medieval Europe up to our days almost, there was a lot of kind of reluctance to look at the erotic dialogues of Plato, because we have the Phaedrus, which was about homosexuality predominantly, and also pederasty, and then we had the Symposium, which was a drunkard's party, literally. And so maybe unfortunately the context of these dialogues, even though they are enriched with such a wealth of concepts about what love is, they haven't been given due attention. And so trying to abstract and looking at these two wise ladies, Aspasia and Diotima, and also Sappho, who also was in the inception of this tradition. If love exists between two individuals, real love, they don't necessarily fall in love and kind of become incapacitated because of all the emotions that are attached to it. They also can rise in love together. And so if two people are together like a couple and they actually grasp this concept, instead of them kind of contriving to want to have the best possible spouse, they will cheer for their spouse to become better, to have character development, and cheer them on and facilitate their own character development, which if it is mutual, they will both benefit each other's character just by their relationship. So to me, this is love. And if this love, which people call platonic love anyway, but it's not, it's in fact comes before Plato. So this kind of love applied to society through the concept of Diotima's ladder of love. So it goes from just the self-centered love for an individual body, materialistic
Mhm.
love, going higher in higher ranks. All bodies are worthy of love, so there's this humanistic concern. Then all souls are worthy of love, so going into the universals, the intrinsic values that there are in sentient consciousness. Then all lovable souls enable institutions to actually exist. So our human civilization is perhaps holding through from a thread, and this thread is made of love, from people being in administrative roles in government and whatnot, surrounded by people that are unfortunately deformed souls and self-centered Machiavellians. And these people are holding things together because they love what they do. They love to be in services, in the service of their fellow humans and society at large. I've seen glimpses of this by kind of interacting with people that were helping me pay my tuition, and I told them I managed to end my studies and find a job that is related to my studies. They rose up and clapped me, and they cheered me, because that's what the meaning they assigned to their role is. And so I figured out that these people actually care for what they're doing. They're not just doing a job. It's more than that. Then there's love for knowledge and love itself. So the transcendental love of that is a foundation of how the cosmos works. And of course, we are a product both of love and conflict, drawing from Empedocles. And we need to describe love very well, as best as possible, so that we can get a love that contributes to character development. And we need to reinterpret catastrophes and conflict and whatnot and calamities, also to gain from them pieces and lessons for character development. So as you can see, we can look at these two sides of the Empedoclean coin for character development. And well, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think you're quite right to point to this, especially this problem of our sort of vague understanding of love. We do not have as rigorous an understanding of what this phenomenon is. And I think particularly in the United States, I might also suspect Great Britain as well, English-speaking countries, there is this tendency to conflate love with compassion. And even though compassion at the right moments may be a part of love, or a sign, perhaps an outward sign of love, it is still something distinct from love itself. And the Greeks in particular, I think Vervaeke does a good job pointing this out, is the Greeks had a very well fleshed out idea, or perhaps, yes, well, fleshed out idea, yes, but they were also very keen to investigate this concept of love. What's very curious to me is the degree to which the verb to love, right, philein, is used in the Greek language to express affinity of all kind, right? You even use it as in a grammatical context. So you'd say, like, okay, for a verb that takes the accusative case, you might say, like, okay, why does, like, to see, diati, blepo, like, why does blepo take the accusative case? Because blepo, the verb, loves the accusative. Blepo philei ten aitiatikein, right? It loves the accusative case. We don't talk like that, right? We don't say things like, well, why do these things go together? Oh, because that thing loves that thing, right? We don't, like, it's to express an affinity. It's to express that there is something that on their own, right, these are parts of a greater whole. And that because of that, they share this particular relationship of affinity where they are connected. And so there is, so I'm going to say, I'm seeing your comments pop up here. Yes, several different Several different Greek words here. Very good. So there is this idea in the West. I think there is this idea that we are missing love of some sort. I think this was perhaps a problem, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. Something happened with the death of God. Something happened with the removal of the value, God is love of Christianity that's removed. That I think, certain thinkers, I think Jung in particular, attributed, for example, the First World War, the problems of the First World War to this. Before him, Nietzsche said that the problems of the 20th century, the socialistic crises of the 20th century, would occur because of this lack of love, that love would be replaced by ressentiment, as he expresses it. This is something that Orwell observed in The Road to Wigan Pier, that socialists are brought together not so much by love of the poor, but hatred of the rich. So there is this, across a number of different thinkers, there is this sort of societal or civilizational pathology of an absence of love. And particularly of this love, I think, that you gesture to, in the sense that it is to love something is to be a part, an emergent part, not a separate part, but an emergent part of a greater whole, which is made evident in the presence of the relationship that those two poles perhaps have to one another. And that their whole is expressed through this polarity, if it's dipolar, right? Something like that. Love is not just restricted to 2 points and the relationship between them, but is something, of course, much more. So I think this idea, right, in the West, we've become very compassionate. We've created in our interview, the same interview, there is a gesture to the pseudo-religions, the pseudo-religions of Western bureaucracies. And there's something there where it's like there's this idea that there needs to be love, right? This word gets thrown around a lot, particularly in the a diversity, equity, inclusion pseudo-religion that often takes on this kind of religious form, uses a lot of the time the language of love. But what is actually practiced is compassion, is a kind of unlimited compassion, from whence stems this idea of virtue signaling, of a display, right? That everything else is to be sacrificed for the sake of displays of a kind of narcissistic compassion. And I think there's a Joe Rogan interview of Peterson, one of his more recent ones, where he says, right, okay, he was approached by a woman who said that she had one child who was transsexual and one child who was pansexual, and that's the way that they were born. And so he made this comparison and said, okay, the odds of being transsexual is, right, generally having, this clinically having, being diagnosed with gender dysphoria is 1 in 3,000. And the odds of being pansexual are not known because, this isn't a thing that popped up, until very recently. So whatever it is, it's rarer than that. But let's say at least at basis that it's as rare as gender dysphoria. The odds of having 2 children be both transsexual and pansexual, each one is each, are 1 in 9 million. And the odds that the odds that this person, this mother, was a narcissistic, was using narcissistic displays of her own compassion as the fundamental guiding ethos of how she was raising her children, were 8,999,999 to 1, which is a very powerful way to frame that. But it's this idea of like, okay, yeah, some people are attempting to use this kind of compassion and the symbols associated with unbounded compassion as the highest good in place of, right, and it's sort of, it mimics Christianity in a way, in that compassion is similar to love. It shares some things that are similar to love. And in many cases, showing compassion is a sign of love, but it is not necessarily wholly and entirely the same thing, as you've wonderfully displayed here with a number of these particular Greek terms that you shared with our audience.
I would like to add as well that our kind of scarcity of vocabulary, this kind of simple speak that we are unfortunately navigating through, almost Orwellian. But we don't need to be victims of it, because we can easily go back to Greek and Latin and start to use, and even Sanskrit and Persian, Farsi and whatnot, and even Chinese, and start using these words in our day-to-day language, because they are missing there. When we, instead of just using love just broadly and using this four-letter word to do all the heavy work, we can use agape when we're talking about even a material sacrifice happening when we are helping someone else, because our soul has been benefited from some character development, that even the sacrifice that we do in material terms pales in comparison to the eudaimonia that we are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, the ataraxia, the tranquility that we are experiencing. The material sacrifice is nothing compared to that. And also the drive for us to personify another individual, to make them even more human, even more a person, it pays off so much more than the trivialities of whatever it is that we are giving or whatever it is that we are doing in service for this other person. So I see this represented in Christianity, as Vervaeke eloquently puts in his lectures, and as I've been able to garner from the study of Hellenistic tradition and how it influenced the emergence of Jesus. I like to say, what did it take to make a Jesus role model? Apparently, it took almost the entirety of Europe with emphasis to Greco-Roman culture, the Middle East, the Levant, with emphasis to the Judaic culture, and South Asia with emphasis to Ahimsa traditions like Jainism and Buddhism. Although these connections are kind of sketchy and difficult to make, but the similarities are so enticing that's I had to mention them. Also, when we look at the world that has been produced from nominalism, Cartesianism, purely materialistic scientific thinking, that even science to me is just one of the philosophical traditions. It's just that it's so successful that we don't even, it even affords the luxury of not considering itself in competition with other things like Nyaya and Jainism and Buddhism and Platonism and actual Pyrrhonic skepticism and whatnot. But it is there. It's just that it has so much success. But we have kind of used these more materialistic traditions that don't look at the ineffable as kind of like the murder weapon with which Nietzsche seems to describe that we have killed the panentheistic God. So it came from Thales in the Ionian tradition saying everything is made of gods, to nothing is God, no God, everything is dead matter just doing its thing mechanistically. So maybe we need to reevaluate how we interpret the world. So we are looking at a very dead universe, but we could be looking at it as a cosmetic universe, like Pythagoras coined the term. Also, I wanted to share with you a thought exercise that kind of tries to express in expressionist terms to to show what's at play here. What are the stakes? So in a kind of Douglas Adams kind of way, imagine everything was lost. We failed. Society and the biosphere collapse. And it's not until centuries of environmental recovery, facilitated by a desperate project that the best of our minds could put together. We kind of implemented AI and robotics to help nature recover by preserving seeds and animal embryos and whatnot. And this is kind of like a nuclear fallout scenario or a gray goo scenario. Everything was consumed. Everything in biomatter was consumed by this calamity that was human made. So think that only after a few centuries or maybe millennia will the biosphere be reconstituted by this desperately made project. And only after all this time, the first generation, and again, a renewed generation of human beings can be produced by robotically artificial wombs, by the best technology that we could muster, and also robotic caretakers of these first human beings. So there's this situation here. Now imagine that you are the project owner of this project that will ensure the existence of this new generation in a reconstituted biosphere. What knowledge that we have achieved and accumulated will we leave to these future humans, and how? All knowledge without restrictions, just giving all these kind of naive new humans everything from philosophy with ethics to the knowledge to enrich uranium, modify genes, build new viruses, new pandemics, new plagues, genetic modifications, whatnot. Or B, only the knowledge considered safe, quote unquote safe, excluding things like nuclear energy, molecular biology, genetic alterations, and artificial intelligence. Or C, go clean slate, let them start from scratch with no knowledge of what they consider the ancients, us. Or D, leave all knowledge, but the incrementally more dangerous knowledge can only be obtained after demonstrating merit in successive stages. So they need to figure out ethics first before they can get the biggest fruits of scientific technological progress that can radically transform nature. So yeah, I can also share in the comments the options. So A, B, C, and D. And this has been my attempt to represent. So now think also about how our education of the next generations, which we normally do without any calamity, any, nothing like this, making things more salient to us, to increase the visibility of what is at stake in this transfer of knowledge. How could our what we do in education of next generations benefit from the expressiveness of this thought exercise? Because so much is at stake. We need to figure out in a way how these Japanese people figured out how to build for more than a millennia this temple, but we need to do this broadly. We need to do this in a way that even improves our lot, even improves how we deal with the biosphere, and so that we can even transcend our limitations while preserving nature, while returning to sacred, looking at the intrinsic values of things. So this is where I'm tagging out.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what you've done here.
Why did you ask that hypothetical?
I'm asking the hypothetical because sure.
Yeah.
Really briefly, this is my interpretation of, if we do not figure out the metacrisis, this is a possibility.
Yeah.
This is a possible path of humanity. Really very simplistically, we either go to a massive extinction event that includes us and the biosphere depletion, or we go to a second renaissance and a golden age, and we can figure out very lofty, big cathedral things, like I've mentioned, with colonizing space and being pioneers of spreading consciousness. So these are two extremes, and with possibilities in between. And I argue that we should really try to figure out character education and character development, so that we don't need these desperate measures. We instead do the wisest choices now, when we don't need to do anything desperate.
Yeah, sorry, Kara, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to give the microphone to you.
Okay. Yeah, so I think this is interesting, right? I think there are sort of two biblical narratives that sort of point to this as well, right? Okay, yes, the Renaissance, the European Renaissance, several hundred years ago, was an example of this type of phenomenon. But of course, there are perhaps some of these that are also gestured to in the Bible, right? The state of the world, for example, the time of Noah, was also a part of this, right? The descendants of Cain developed different technological weapons of war, and essentially they developed civilization, right? That's what the descent, the lineage of Cain in Genesis 5 talks about, is the degree to which all the civilization is generated from the descendants of a murderer, and right, even though it's not all bad, it generates civilization, and civilization actually makes things much worse. For all that it brings, for all of its technological achievements, it actually makes things much worse. And a part of this is stated at the beginning of Genesis 6, which is that the day came when the sons of God went and lay with as many of the daughters of Adam the daughters of man as they pleased. And the idea there is, okay, civilization is built. There are all of these technological marvels that have been built that are used for warfare. And the product of this is that the acquisition of all of these tools in this techne, in the Greek sense, is applied to, by the sons of God to sexual pleasure, right? What ensues is something like, a mass collection of an objectification of people and relationships, a loss of relationships, fundamental distrust. I mean, Peterson has talked about, the Gini coefficient, and how sort of the unequal levels of wealth, the more you have wealth inequality, in part, of things, sure, but of access to, reproduction, right? Part of the reason why men become more violent in a society with each other when there is a wealth inequality is that wealth inequality alters the selection patterns of females for reproduction, in that females go, well, there's all these guys who have nothing. Like, there must be something wrong with these guys if they can't have anything. So you end up with an increasingly bunched up, polygamous, polygynous concentration of access to reproduction among only the very extremely wealthy. And you have a large percentage of the population that doesn't reproduce. And what do? They fight each other. They hate the rich, but they can't do anything about it. And they fight and they kill each other. And it's a horrible world to live in. Joe Heinrich, this is an interesting guy, a historical psychologist using quantitative, like big data computer analysis of certain old databases of statistics from church archives, has also come to this finding that, right, the reproductive success. Well, first off, you have this general fact that the reproductive success of all women throughout history as a whole population is about 80%. The reproductive success of men throughout history is about 40% across all of history. But Heinrich interestingly says that sort of in the tribal organization, right, these small sort of social groups of about 150 to 300 people, something like that, the reproductive success of men to women is about 1 to 4. So 1 male successfully reproduces for every 4 women. What's very interesting is that and I'm not sure of his methodology on this, but it's interesting to consider that early civilizations prior to the advent of enforced monogamy as the ideal and the standard went from being 4 successful female reproductions to every 1 male to 16 successful female reproductions for every 1 male. So this is even, right, this sort of situation that's at the beginning of the Noah narrative seems to be, at least in Heinrich's findings, somewhat backed up by this idea of early civilization massively perverts this ratio. And you see this 4 to 1 ratio manifest in some of the Abrahamic traditions. So for example, Jacob is favored by God in the narratives. Jacob does not go beyond 4 wives. Even though polygyny is allowed, it's sort of tolerated, you can find God's favor in the Old Testament and in Old Judaism. It is never polygyny that goes beyond 4 wives. It keeps to that 4 to 1 ratio. In Islamic societies today, you have a preservation of that. For example, like in Pakistan, it's actually strictly illegal that you cannot have more than 4 wives. You can practice polygyny, but not more than 4 wives. So you see that 1 to 4 ratio preserved. Christianity, perhaps also sort of inheriting this sort of, well, okay, Noah lives a pretty good life with just 1 wife, right? Stuff goes really, really great with him with just 1 wife. And also the Roman tradition of, only 1 wife. I mean, you can have kind of levirate marriage and things like that, but it inherits this and then has an even sort of stricter version of it enforced through the medieval church with sort of laws on consanguinity. That there is, I think I lost my my point. Oh, this was to your 4th point. There is an issue here about taking civilization too far. Okay, it gets expressed through this kind of marriage perversion of relationships element, but there is this issue of taking relationships too far. The answer in the Noah story is the ark, which is you thinking about these options here. That's an ark situation. That's the ark narrative. What is interesting is that the New Testament's answer to that, and sort of the late, right, Judaism goes through this too in sort of the Hellenistic period, the post-Babylonian period of, this is when the wisdom books are written. The entire canon is sort of reorganized and edited, and you get the prophets, right, the later prophets predicting the coming of a Messiah who will be the healer of nations. And we have the delivery of Christ, who is, right, he is the temple, which in the Septuagint translation in the New Testament is the same Greek word. It escapes me for the moment, but it's the same word as ark. It's the same word as ark. So when Christ says that he will be the new temple, and the new temple he will rebuild the temple in 3 days, there's an idea that's like, okay, we don't need necessarily, at least from a biblical perspective, right? You have these sort of two scenarios. Okay, there's going to be a doomsday, start prepping, go build the ark. But there's, well, okay, the suggestion in Christianity is, okay, well, there's going to be the hero who comes, right, who is able to reconcile the nations and bring peace and restore a right order of things through, what seems to be, right, this sort of relationship that Christ has. The way that he speaks to the Pharisees is very similar to this sort of way of looking at the world that McGilchrist differentiates between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, right? When they speak to him when they ask him, they say, which is the greatest commandment, right? Which is, of all the 10 commandments, which is the greatest commandment? Because they want him to commit blasphemy, right? By saying one is more important than all the others. And what he does is he says, well, It's these two, right? It's this one: love your neighbor as yourself, and love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul. And the second is like it, which is love your neighbor as yourself. But he doesn't, right? But he also doesn't answer their question. He does answer their question, but he answers it in just the right way so that it's not blasphemy and it's also not exactly what they asked. So it's that similar kind of element there. So I just wanted to highlight that particular similarity there, because it seemed like there were some similar patterns in that kind of thinking, right? It seems that the Renaissance idea is sort of built up in the Christ as arc. And some of these ideas of, okay, what if there's this catastrophe? Is the ark as ark, right? The Noah story as ark. And certainly I think what's interesting is it seems to say that the edited Old Testament canon of the post-exilic period says God will never destroy the earth. God will never allow the earth to be destroyed again under the circumstances that required the building of an ark in such a way. But of course, then Christ comes as kind of like a metaphoric sort of, well, he is, but it's not the same, right? Something like that. But I just wanted to say I'm curious if that was something underpinning your thought there. But it seems like both with your emphasis on self-development and character education and perspective, and this type of thinking, that these two kind of parallel strategies that somewhat go together and that come through in the biblical tradition as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think it was a bold move for me to share this thought exercise that I've been increasingly refining and sharing. It probably is inspired firstly from the arc story, which comes from the Gilgamesh story, and probably farther down to the past where we lost the original kind of thing. And maybe it's even related to some cataclysmic changes in weather patterns that caused whatever it is we are talking about, the Younger Dryas period.
Exactly. I was just thinking that Younger Dryas period.
Yeah, and also the extinction of megafauna that we caused. It's on us. Probably people from that age whispered something to us that sounds like Odin killed all the frost giants. They were also good sources of meats, but they were also these megafauna could destroy humans and destroy whatever it is we build or cultivate or whatnot. So people realized that they had done something terrible to nature that is irreversible. And so maybe the first signs of people relating to the sacred came from there, that realization of being able to do something terrible. This thought exercise, funnily enough, actually came from my contact with the narrative structure of a video game. It's called Horizon Zero Dawn. And it's a magnificently written narrative that I could kind of reinterpret what it means, compare it with what I've learned from these different philosophical traditions, and I think it's magnificently gives us a kind of a memento mori of the entirety of humanity that is sorely needed to be a means of attaining some wisdom. Douglas Adams, in his writings, just in the beginning of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, just says, well, Earth is gone. And so he kind of also gives us this memento mori exercise, this premeditatio malorum. So thinking about the absolute worst that can happen. Okay, it happened. Now what? What can we infer from the absolute worst being able to happen or even having happened? What can this inform us? Not technically, not in terms of science and technology and whatnot, but what does it mean for our character? What character development lessons can we extract from this? Thus, I think expressionism is very important in a thought exercise like this, because it heightens the apparent stakes the stakes are really, really, really high. As I tried to emphasize with the examples of weapons of mass destruction, just pushing buttons, and also what we are doing to nature, to that will not recover, the mass extinction of this Anthropocene that is any marine biologist that you will talk with, or any people that are actually in the fields documenting what is going on, the deforestation and whatnot, they will say that there are alarming things that are happening, and we need to be kind of stoic, in the true stoic sense of, okay, terrible things are happening, I should not pretend bad things are not happening. I should, as much as possible, stave off of this path of ignorance is bliss, and relate to what is happening patiently and kindly with my own character, and come to terms with what is going on. Try to get lessons that will inform what's in my character I need to develop to address this as a character, as a human being. Spread this out, because we will not have a kind of savior character anytime soon that will kind of divert the course of humanity single-handedly. We all need to attain this kind of Christ consciousness as a character, or Buddha being in ourselves. We need to figure this out really, really thoroughly. And thus, I think looking at the meta-crisis, as these three gentlemen discussed in their video, Verveke, let me get the names right, Daniel Schmachtenberger, Ian McGilchrist, and John Verveke.
Ian McGilchrist.
Yeah, exactly. They did a pretty good job. We don't necessarily need to agree with every single thing that they said, but it's hardly contestable that there are these many crises, polycrises, as I mentioned in the comments, that are going on, and they interrelate. And if we try Cartesianly, mechanistically to address the climate problem isolatedly, we create economic problems, which will create war and conflicts and increase the risk of mutually assured destruction. If we only try to reduce the proliferation of nuclear weapons, we will probably create other unknown and unforeseen problems, when perhaps at the root of this polycrisis that integrates into a metacrisis is actually a famine of wisdom. And so if we actually address the famine of wisdom and the associated lack of character development in education and upbringing of human beings, of next generations, maybe we have a chance to tackle this. But we really need to use all the tricks that we have acquired throughout humanity and throughout these religions and wisdom traditions and whatnot. We should spare no expenses, as the guy from Jurassic Park said, to acquire all this wisdom that we have there, and we should try this out.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you.
Rogério, guys, I'm sorry, I will need to cut that short.
I was just going to ask you
we are
about
closing in 5
time.
minutes. But Michael, I will let you have the final closing statement, because Rogério has like brilliantly put everything out there, like nicely summarized it. Michael, I will allow you to address it a little bit, just bit in between, to thank the people who actually watch us. I would like to very quickly address Dust. So Dust, again, thank you for being a loyal viewer. You talk about the lone suffering, and actually people who live their life just suffering without experiencing love and without experiencing meaning. In the concept of metacrisis, it is a big problem. I'm like kind of story, we did not touch on it, but we did a little bit. There is the desire of master, basically, which is missing. It's like this reason, why do we do it? Why do we have to suffer? And like, what's our place in building the cathedral, let's say? to use this as a metaphor of our building being a place in society, let's say. So thank you, Das. And now the word to Michael, and after that we will close. And guys, all the links are below. Please check out and support of my guests. Absolutely a wonderful conversation. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I thought that's a very excellent point to conclude on, Roger. Perhaps sometime in the future we could talk about. This was certainly a question I had. Maybe you and I can talk about it. Maybe on one of your platforms, something like that. Is maybe some of the practicality of this, right? We've thought a lot about the sort of, we've analyzed the problem a lot here. We've outlined it, sort of found common ground, found sort of, especially this common position. I think you're absolutely right on this. This famine of wisdom, this famine of well, yeah, like you've said too, character of value and such, right? That there needs to be, and I liked this point that you brought up too. This idea that we can't wait for the next Christ to come and solve all the problems, that there has to be this distribution of that kind of Christ, elements of Christ, or the Christ's way of looking at the world in that sort of idea into many, many people. I think that's kind of the idea behind at least the Catholic and Orthodox interpretation of the Eucharist in particular, right? The idea that you take the body, you take the actual body of Christ into you. You love Christ, right? In that way, it is an act of love. And Christ becomes a part of you in the way that food becomes a part of you. Christ, the living God, becomes a part of you, and it distributes. Christ comes and works through you and becomes a part of you. You refresh Christ's presence within you through that ritual, something like that. But I think that's right. I would love to talk a bit more, about in the future about the practicalities of this. I know in this particular dialogue or conversation between these three, trialogue, right, that there was a question of practice and an emphasis on practice, that it has to be, in order to actually make this work, there's got to be this component of practice, not of engineering necessarily, but of going through what is that process of building this Japanese temple and remodeling it look like, right? How do we necessarily get that going? I have my thoughts on that in a historical context, but love to hear more about that certainly in the future. So thank you so much, Kara. Thank you so much for organizing this. I thought this was a wonderful conversation. It's wonderful to talk to you both in this context as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you again, both of my guests and the viewers. That was an interesting conversation. I have more questions now than answers, which a great conversation probably should be. There you go. And I would throw one question out there without unanswered, just to meditate on in this holiday season, which would be, if the master doesn't want to lead, the master has the vision, but all the moving power is in his emissary. Like he's the one who does the little things and kind of takes over everything. Of course, the master is busy with his big ideas. How can we merge them together in this sort of opponent processing? Not adversarial processing, but when they are cooperating with each other equally and each of them knows their place. How do we come to that? That one I have still mysterious and open. Thank you, guys.
Write that one down. We'll do another live session. We'll talk about that. That sounds great.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. And bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye.